The Greens under Zack Polanski are ahead of Labour in some opinion polls, and Labour are clearly very worried. Rachel Reeves name-checked Zack Polanski in her budget.
I know that the leader of the Green Party is a keen hypnotherapist, and he believes that he can achieve remarkable things using only the power of his mind. Unfortunately, the only things getting bigger under his approach would be the deficit and the rate of inflation.
So the joke there was a reference to Zack Polanski agreeing to use hypnosis to help a Sun journalist increase their breast size. That was a decade ago. Polanski's response to Reeves' jibe was, I think, quite strong. So he said a few things are getting bigger, Chancellor. Green Party membership, Green Party polling, and Labour's increased desperate attacks. And then he says, if you agree, we should be bringing down bills and taxing the super wealthy, join thegreenparty.org. So he does this thing now when anyone's attacking him, he sort of quote tweets them and has the link for join the Green Party, which seems to be working because they got 175,000 members, which is pretty damn decent. Rachel Reeves, though, clearly does think she's found a weakness in Zack's platform, so not from his past, but from his present. And scrutiny over whether Polanski's plans would increase debt and inflation have increased since his interview with Laura Kuenssberg, where he suggested we shouldn't worry too much about debt or the bond markets. That interview prompted an article in Bloomberg this week saying the City of London was worried about the Greens' disregard for markets. They quoted a leading investment banker saying this. So he's a pound shop Andy Burnham is basically what we're concluding. There's this idea that it's the ideological attachment of people in the city or people in the mainstream who have this association. The reality is it's a function of having creditors to the tune of £2.7 trillion. That was a leading investment banker saying, we're not here trying to exert ideological pressure on the government. It's just if you're in debt to us, you're going to have to show us you can pay it back. Polanski responded to that article saying this. The city and elites are apparently worried about me. The people who bankrupted this country are spooked. Won't someone think of the billionaires again with that join.greenparty.org.uk? This strategy is really working for him. Polanski also did an interview with the New Statesman this week, though, where he was asked about his spending plans and fiscal rules. And this is from that piece. It's written by George Eaton. The charge that Polanski will face is that the Greens' tax plans would not fund their promise of a £160 billion rise in day-to-day spending. Would he adopt fiscal rules to reassure the markets? And then this is a quote from Polanski. The fiscal rule we need to have is to make sure that inflation doesn't go higher than the skills and resources that we have in our economy. And then George Eaton writes, it's an argument reminiscent of modern monetary theory, MMT, which argues that inflation is the only real restraint on countries such as the UK that can issue their own currency in brackets, and which mainstream economists often dismiss as voodoo economics. James, what's going on here? I suppose I'll put my cards on the table. I think Zack is on very strong ground when he's talking about the need for a wealth tax. Article in Reuters this week sort of saying the Norwegians, actually theirs has worked quite well. The public want one. I think the economics stacks up. Some of this stuff about spending, I think, are where the weaknesses are. I wanted to know what your perspective is.
Look, I think Zack's basically dealt with this well throughout. He's given some clear and direct and entirely truthful answers. I mean, look, if you're telling Laura Kuenssberg or anybody else that the Bank of England owns about 20% of UK government debt, £550 billion, I think it's a figure at the minute, this is entirely accurate. This is, in fact, what has happened as a result of doing quantitative easing for the last 15 or so years, since 2009. So yeah, it's a long old period of time. The Bank of England has been effectively lending money to government by buying its bonds. So that is true. The difficulty and the challenge is this may be true, but what do you do with that fact? I mean, look, I think Zack also did the right thing in talking about why is it that we are paying large amounts of money to the Bank of England as a result of quantitative easing, about £20 billion a year, which the Bank of England takes and then hands out as interest payments to various commercial banks that have a bank account with the Bank of England. This is a side effect of quantitative easing. And he's right to raise that. And he's not the only politician who's done that. I mean, Gordon Brown has talked about this being a problem. Richard Tice has talked about this being a problem. Paul Tucker, not a politician, but former deputy governor of the Bank of England, has talked about this. So I think when Zack brings into question the relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England and says this is somewhat dysfunctional in a large part that is costing us money. I mean, £20 billion a year, which is what we're handing over to the Bank of England, is a lot of money. You won't necessarily get all of that, but you can get a great old chunk of it. I think he's right. Where he's going to have difficulty, and you can see the difficulties appearing in some of the responses to the Laura Kuenssberg interview, is that what can look like an abstract accountancy truth, the Bank of England owns 20% of UK government debt, true, does not mean that you can just go, the Bank of England can therefore cancel the entirety of that debt and monetize £550 billion, and this is a consequence-free environment. It is not. The polarization of some of the discussion around that between what I think is a deeply unhelpful argument from people influenced by modern monetary theory, which goes, hey, the debt doesn't really matter, government can just print money, on one side. Or on the other hand, actually, a bunch of people going like, the bond markets are all powerful, we must bow down before them, and everything we do is subservient to what the bond markets want. Both of these things are wrong, right? We're in a difficult situation. It's going to be dealing with the economy we have, getting it working is a bit like diffusing a bomb. You're going to have to pick away at various bits carefully so the thing doesn't blow up in your face. Liz Truss just went chonk straight to all the wires and it blew up. So we don't want to do that. So there's a point in between that we have to get to. Ideas like the ones that Zack and Gordon Brown and Richard Tice, to give him credit, have talked about, which is paying less money to the Bank of England to run its monetary operations. I think this is a good thing to talk about. Going whoopee-doo, a load of debt is just owed to the Bank of England, which Zack didn't say. He didn't say the next step, which is, hey, let's just cancel it. But just going, oh, okay, that's all we need to think about. It's not real money. It's all fake. Off we go. That's not good either. But then again, neither is the Labour government's approach of going like, everything is subservient to the bond markets. That's all we have to worry about. We've got to pick our way through this. And that's not necessarily a clear and simple and immediate sort of conversation to have. But I think we have to get to the point of having a serious conversation about it at least.
Is there a bit of a power struggle going on? Obviously, the Green Party is now where all the action is at. I mean, with all due respect to your party, maybe they'll pull it out of the hat this weekend. But at the moment, as it stands in the polls, the Green Party is where it's at. And it does seem like Zack sometimes sounds a bit like Gary Stevenson. So he's talking about the thing you definitely need to do is tax the rich, and that's all that really matters. Not that Gary would say that's all that really matters, but that's sort of the key thing. And then sometimes he is sounding more MMT. So I do think the fiscal rule we need to have is to make sure that inflation doesn't go higher than the skills and resources we have in our economy. That does sound, I mean, I can't make much sense of that, but it does sound like MMT. You were listed in Bloomberg as the unofficial advisor to Zack Polanski. Is there a sort of struggle going on between MMTers and people who believe in fiscal rules? Can you give us any update?
Look, what I've just described is the complexity of the situation. Here's what's happened. For the last 15 years or so, and all the way up into the pandemic and a bit beyond, you could do the Corbyn programme that we had from 2015 onwards, which was basically like, we can just borrow a load of money and it doesn't matter, really, because interest rates are the lowest in human history, right? For about a decade or more, that was maybe not quite. Yeah, it's not bad. That's around about that, 2015 through to about 2022, right? That was the case. Interest rates are incredibly low. Inflation is incredibly low. Corbynism could be a program of not talking that much really about taxing the rich. It didn't. There was no wealth tax that I recall. It wasn't part of the discussion. But it could be, we're going to borrow a load of money and invest across the country and rebuild the economy, which is what markets were telling you should be doing, because that's what it means when you have really low interest rates. It's people desperate to lend you money. What's happened since the pandemic, with the various shocks we've had since then, with inflation creeping up, interest rates are now much higher than they will be. Inflation is much higher than it was. These things aren't going to change. So when you start talking about borrowing and when you start talking about how the government can add to its debt, it has more consequence. That is a true fact in the world that we now are part of. And for a country like Britain, which is very much exposed to what happens in the rest of the world, we import half the gas that we burn here for our heating and our electricity. We rely on at least 30% of our food is purely imported, and we have to import an awful lot of fertilizer to grow the food we do grow here. We're really exposed to what happens in the rest of the world. We're really exposed to whether or not we can borrow money from the rest of the world to pay for some of this stuff. Right? That's the economy we live in. It's kind of weak and shaky. So some of the arguments that are starting to play out is when you move from standing on the sidelines, which sadly, I think the Greens and the left for a long period of time had done, and you can comment on things and say, wouldn't it be nice if, to being at a point where, what would it be like if you had to run the government? What does a credible, plausible, implementable, radical plan for government actually look like? And that's when these questions become serious, and you can't just go, it sort of doesn't matter. it sort of doesn't matter if you're borrowing. It kind of does matter, right? Because you have to deal with the economy we're in, not the one we want to get to, but we need a path to get there. And that's going to have to deal with what are you going to do about the bond markets? What are you going to do about the Bank of England? What are you going to do about the Treasury? These big institutional questions are the ones we're up against. So I view this sort of tension that's appearing as a function of the Greens' success and the fact that we're now in a world where it is plausible. It's plausible that the Greens could be in the next government that we have in this country.